Good morning, everybody. My name is Rose Kalanik. I'm here with several colleagues from Defense Priorities, Dan DePetris, Chris McCallion, Ben Friedman, and Danny Davis. And we're here to discuss Trump's recent trip to the Middle East that is just concluding as we speak. Thanks, everybody, for coming to talk on the roundtable and to view the roundtable this morning. Overall, the trip's gotten a lot of buzz and a lot of attention. Trump arrived on Tuesday. He started his trip in Saudi Arabia, concluded some deals with the Saudis. The next day, he went to Qatar, concluded some deals with the Qataris. And on his last day of the visit today, he's been in the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Lots of stuff to talk about, potentially. But I think the biggest question on people's minds, sort of the overarching question, is what happened during this trip, right? Trump's speeches, his decisions, his deals, et cetera. Is this the start of some kind of policy change in the Middle East? Are we moving away from an era of sort of deep interventionism in the region? Is Trump going to herald a policy change where the United States steps back, which is something that's been sort of on the docket for many years, even though the U.S. hasn't actually managed to execute it? So is this the start of a change in policy, or is it just a blip, right? Or just stasis that we're going to look and see going forward? So my question for myself to start off, and all of my co-panelists, is what's your biggest takeaway from this trip? And I'll start with my own, which is that my biggest takeaway was the dogs that didn't bark, so to speak, right? So we had a lot of things teased in front of us at the beginning of this trip, including the possibility that the United States and Saudi Arabia could reach some kind of deal, not just a business deal, not just an arms procurement deal, which we did see, but a deal that involved a sort of formal security commitment to Saudi Arabia, something along the lines of the deal that was discussed by the Biden administration under the context of having normalization with Israel, right? And in that potential deal that was on the drawing board, the U.S. was considering engaging in nuclear cooperation with the Saudis and potentially offering them something like a security guarantee or something like an alliance. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen, and it wasn't really discussed at all during the trip, at least in a public-facing format. So to me, that suggests, okay, this could actually be a change in the works because it's a departure from what Biden did. Of course, Trump is very interested in being different from Biden. But of course, as with everything with this administration, it's a little too soon to tell. So let's just go through the group. And Dan, how about you? What's your big takeaway?
Yeah, hi, Rose. I think my big takeaway is that Trump, it's sort of an obvious point, but I think it's important, is Trump is very, very obsessed with making agreements, regardless of what the agreements look like, what the details look like. Obviously, Trump struck a number of economic and investment pacts with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris. But in terms of like geopolitics and the security issues, there wasn't much there. But I do think it's notable that pretty much in every stop of his trip, he referenced the ongoing negotiations with Iran. It seems like every open forum he had, whether it was, speaking to a room full of Gulf investors or just reporters on Air Force One, he brought the Iran issue. He elevated that up to a top priority. And he made the point constantly that there is a deal in the works. He kind of embellished about what the deal would look like and how soon we could possibly get it. But I think that tells me that Trump is very interested in striking some sort of a nuclear agreement and essentially, elevating diplomacy over some of these more hawkish advisors within his administration and within Washington, whether it's, a return to maximum pressure or even using military force. So I think that was mildly encouraging. But of course, with Trump, we'll have to monitor this in the next couple of weeks and months to see if he actually follows through on his promises.
Chris, why don't you go next, and then Ben, then Danny?
Sure. Well, the most interesting part of the trip was probably that speech that Trump gave where he criticized, neocons and nation builders and so forth. That being said, Trump is also the guy who has said that we're going to take over Gaza and make it beautiful, and kind of sounds like a nation building project. And nothing was really resolved in terms of what's going to happen with our potential involvement in what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, where they've approved plans to basically displace the whole population and raise everything to the ground. I agree that it's in a way like the dog that didn't bark is kind of the lead here, because it's not clear exactly what, beyond just bringing in some Gulf money to the United States, what exactly was achieved, or if we'll even know what was achieved for some time. I think lifting the sanctions on Syria is a good thing. At the same time, I'm quite, suspect that we should be necessarily giving Shara an attaboy and necessarily making nice with them as well, because it's really not clear at this point what the actual nature of the new Syrian government is. And I think if we want the U.S. to be less involved in the Middle East, that means on the one hand we don't have to go around trying to topple everyone's government and do nation building, but it also means we don't have to act like everyone's our friend either. We can have normal business-like relations. We can probably ignore most countries in that region because, frankly, it's just a region that isn't of that much strategic importance to the U.S. And we could lift sanctions on Syria and probably, have minimal contact with them from that point on. So, yeah, I don't know. To some extent, I suppose the trip was maybe not what we expected, or a little anticlimactic. I'm glad we didn't make any kind of binding security guarantees to the Saudis, and it's kind of interesting, at least, that the U.S. seems to have kind of held Israel at arm's length over the course of the trip.
Yeah. Just to elaborate on that point, I think Israel's another big dog that didn't bark here on the trip. Obviously Trump didn't go there. Hegseth was supposed to go there at the same time and didn't. Whether or not that's an intended affront to the Israelis, it's I think perhaps perceived as that, and that comes along with, more substantively, the agreement to stop bombing the Houthis, which obviously wasn't part of the trip, but came a few weeks before, where we have Trump essentially agreeing to almost nothing, to stop bombing them in exchange for them not shooting at American ships, not even agreeing to stop shoot at all the ships in the water, but beyond that, dealt not at all with Israel and the threat the Houthis have posed to Israel by firing missiles at them in response to the war in Gaza. So, and then thirdly, I guess this is all happening as the Trump administration tries to negotiate a deal with Iran, which the Israelis are opposed to. So the Trump administration seems to be breaking from what appeared to be the very close ties with Netanyahu and the government of Israel. It seems different, perhaps, than the first term. Now, that doesn't mean that they're committed to any kind of nice outcomes for Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank, or pushing a peace deal that people in Europe or on the American left would favor. But it does seem to be a kind of general disinclination to be overly involved with the Israelis or too close to them, and I think that is actually positive for U.S. interests in the region, and shows a willingness to prioritize American interests over that of Israel and to some extent probably other allies. So that's, I think, one big takeaway is at least a change in direction. We'll see if it changes back again in the next couple of years.
And as for me, I would certainly echo most of the things that have been said there. Especially, I was probably most I don't know, excited is probably too strong of a word, but hopeful on that speech he gave about nation building being disaster. I like that he chronicled so many of the disasters and how it's been unaffected, et cetera, at least implying that he's not going to go down that path anymore. But then in the same speech, he talks about, Iran, they're not going to get a nuclear weapon. And if, we'll try it this way. And that sounded like, well, maybe not nation building, but certainly involving in that. And we definitely hope that he doesn't go in a Connecticut area there, because that would be bad for everybody. In terms of the no security guarantees, I think my assessment is that at least a portion of the reason why that wasn't brought up publicly is because Saudi Arabia, to have normalization with Israel and to be a part of the Abraham Accords, which is a huge issue both for Israel and the United States, something they've been trying to get done. Trump definitely wants to expand on his legacy from the first time he set it up. Saudi Arabia is adamantly demanding a two-state solution first. They said, we're not going to go down this path unless we get that path. And I think if they go down the two-state path, then they would say, and we want security guarantees, and which would be great for Trump on this legacy part, but really bad from our perspective on no security guarantees, not even any quasi-security guarantees that we should give. But then again, of course, you also have Israel. There's no way that they're going to agree to a two-state solution. They were always against it, but now it's just categorically off the table. They're talking more about empty the Gaza Strip and reprocessing it with their own people, et cetera. So those things are just completely incompatible. So I think that for this deal here, this trip, that the Gulf is just too large to broach, and that's why he just said in kind of whimsical, I hope we can get there someday. So in a certain sense, that's good. But in another sense, it's I don't even want that on the table. The other thing that I wanted to point out was that he didn't go to Israel. So that, I think, was a definite signal. Hegseth didn't go to Israel. I don't think those can be anything besides comments, but it's not clear what the word is, because he has definitely been backing off, from going everywhere from just 2 months ago saying, if Iran doesn't do as we ask and doesn't agree to what I say, then bombs will be falling. And then he said in the Oval Office on March 7th, folks, we're in the last days here. We're in the last strokes. There's something coming if they don't do this what they want. And then all of a sudden, now it's like, let's go with diplomacy and Witkoff and all this. And he's talking about ways to not do that. So that, I don't think at all was in Israel's favor. And then instead of, as was mentioned a second ago, instead of, we're going to, he passed that video, that AI created video of him in the Gaza Strip with Elon Musk and Netanyahu on the beach, sipping Mai Tais, et cetera. Now, all of a sudden, he's saying, well, you know what? Maybe we should bring this to an end. Just as Netanyahu saying, we're ready to start another invasion of the Gaza Strip. So lots going on there. And none of that was even addressed. So I think that other than the big deals that were signed, which certainly for those few American businesses, that was good. But the thing that concerns me the most, the unknown, Gulf organizations and governments are not keen on just giving something away for nothing. And those were some huge, huge deals that were struck. And I wonder, what do they expect on the other side of that? Not the least of which for a $400 million airplane from Qatar. But that's kind of my real quick takeaway.
Yeah, those are excellent points. It's kind of extraordinary how many mixed signals we're getting out of this administration, both during the trip and before the trip, and who knows for after the trip, right? But I guess I'm curious, like, do you guys really think these business deals are important or significant or big deals, right? Like, Trump obviously wants to take a lot of credit for them, but two things sort of occur to me. Like, one, since when is the U.S. president's job to negotiate a bunch of business deals, like not trade arrangements, but like business deals? And isn't that a little weird? Isn't that a little bit away from sort of the market economy basics that we like to sort of go with? So A, not sure it's really an appropriate thing for the president to be doing, but B, how impactful are they really for the U.S. economy or the U.S. weapons industry, et cetera, et cetera? And then I guess C, like, are we giving something away by having these deals? I mean, accepting a $400 million plane, that's obviously getting something for nothing that sort of raises eyebrows and wonder, makes you wonder. But like, I don't know, like, don't these deals help the Gulf states as much as it helps the United States, or perhaps maybe more? And what do you guys think about that?
I can jump in first. I just think habit of Trump that we saw in his first term when it came to this stuff was to make big fanfare about not so much, and that happened with weapons deals with the Saudis, where it wasn't really clear. There's these big announcements with big numbers of arms that they were going to buy, and it's not clear that there was any. It is actually fairly clear that it wasn't a real commitment to do that. It was sort of like a press release that didn't have a lot more substance behind it. Of course, they do buy a lot of arms in the first place, so it's sort of just continuing with what was already happening, and sort of announcing that there might be more. Similarly here, I think the Saudis and Gulf states obviously export a lot of oil, gas, and reinvest a lot of the proceeds in the United States. That's been how it's been going for a long time. So it's not clear how much of that money is new and how firm any commitment to reinvest in the United States is. So I don't think it's a bad thing, and as far as Trump pushing these business deals, I mean, of course it's a little unusual, but at the same time, I personally would rather have him doing this than a lot of the other things I can imagine him doing. So, if he wants to kind of push for Saudi investment in the United States, it seems to me pretty harmless or even useful compared to a lot of the alternatives I could imagine. I'll leave it to others to
about it, I guess. And I thought it was a little bit odd that the president was basically negotiating for, and I'll just pick one, I think it was 160 Boeing airplanes, and I was thinking already, wait, what about the other players in the industry, in the aerospace industry? Why did he only go in there for Boeing? I didn't hear anything about any competition or any discussion, just an announcement that Boeing had gotten this. So I don't know if something had been going on behind the scenes and he just announced it, or what may have been going on there. That just seemed peculiar to me. So I'm not sure if what may have been going on with that. As Ben said, it's also, all right, let's see what actually happens with this, because those are some awfully big numbers that were being tossed around there. And I'd like to see some specifics about an execution plan, how that's actually going to get done. The last thing that I would mention on this particular topic here is, Trump was feted so much and lavished, with air jet escorts coming in with all the big pomp and circumstance on the ground with these big numbers here. And I'm just concerned that it really looks like these guys know Trump well, and they're giving him all the things he wants. Obviously, this huge applause, et cetera. And I kind of echoing back what I said a second ago, I'm just concerned that they may want something to Saudi people later, and they may come back and say, hang on, you agreed to this and we did this, and we're kind of expecting something. And I just don't know what that is. That's kind of opaque a little bit, but something I worry about, because the Middle East people are generally, not just let's give Donald Trump whatever he wants with nothing in return.
Yeah, those are good points, Danny. I wanted to I want to jump in. I'm kind of more interested in, at least for me, is why Trump decided, like, what are the motivations for Trump in striking these agreements? I know a lot of it is probably just Trump wanting to come back home with some wins, quite frankly, because he wasn't going to get that in terms of big, grand diplomatic deals. Gaza seems to be kind of an inscrutable issue for him, and he's gone back and forth. He's interested one week in solving the conflict, and then in the next week, he essentially hands it off to Netanyahu to basically do whatever the Israelis want to do in Gaza. I think part of this was probably Trump wanting something to kind of point to justify spending 3-4 days in the Persian Gulf. And I think a lot of it also has to do with China. I mean, there's certainly people in the administration that are whispering in the president's ears saying, if you don't do these types of agreements, the Chinese are going to swoop in and kind of take market share in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia. We can obviously debate whether those are legitimate concerns. I mean, personally, I think, and I know, Rose, you wrote a paper about this, I believe it was last week, that, Washington has a tendency to overemphasize Chinese power in the Middle East and China's intentions, and kind of overestimate its power and influence there. I happen to agree with you, but I think it's still, regardless of whether it's an accurate description of China's motivations in the region, I think that does probably motivate the Trump administration to strike these kind of economic agreements. To the extent that these agreements are actually real or not, as Ben pointed out, I don't know. I mean, there's been plenty of instances in this first term where he's announced a $100 billion weapons deal to the Saudis, and of course, weapons deals are notoriously difficult to and time consuming to implement in full. So I was just curious what others people think about, what is actually motivating Trump to strike these agreements in the first place. Is it China? Is it just his personal inclination to be a deal maker, or is it something else that I'm not seeing? Maybe Chris can give me some.
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump obviously gets pretty enthusiastic about these kind of economic deals. But it may actually be a form of economic diplomacy that's really whose the political goal of which is to forge closer ties with the Gulf, particularly at a time when they're pursuing the deal with Iran, and maybe they are starting to lose some patience with the Israelis. I think they see the Gulf monarchies as an independent pole, as a source of support in the region. I think they definitely are driven by what you were just saying, Dan, this kind of fear that if they don't maintain close ties with the Gulf, that China will swoop in, and apparently that's supposed to have some kind of negative consequences. I don't really think so, but I think that's probably a motivation, and the fear here is that the administration feels that if it makes a deal with Iran, it needs to make some kind of concomitant concession to the Saudis, say, right, or to the Israelis on the other side. And I think that's why there was some trepidation about what Trump was actually going to offer to them on this trip. Like Danny was saying, there's probably a lot behind the scenes that we're not hip to yet, right? Like they were probably having all kinds of conversations and floating all kinds of ideas and exchanges that we're not going to know about. For the time being, right, it seems like there wasn't that much offered, or there weren't that many, further binding entanglements made. But it could be that, these initial deals were just a kind of, the beginning of a broader process, a broader political process of forging even closer ties with the Gulf. Trump seems to have some personal affinities with the Gulf leaders. That oil money buys a lot of golden toilets. So I suppose that's my sense of it. One thing that people have raised are some concerns about some of the deals made regarding AI and technology transfers, that may not be to the U.S.'s long-term benefit, but I haven't formed any independent assessment of it. I just think it's an interesting issue to raise.
And one thing I'll tag on there again, we also can't disentangle the fact that Trump really likes splashy, big, and to win, and that's been kind of the hallmark of this whole second term so far in this early days. Is he loves big, splashy announcements and claims of these huge successes or so. So he gets these, billion-dollar trades with all these people, and looks all this great stuff. But then if he didn't have that, if you just looked at the diplomacy, it's like, okay, nothing gets solved with the Gaza thing. Hardly even gets addressed, even though he's in the Middle East and there's people starving, according to him, which he said subsequently. Nothing got done with the Abraham Accords. Nothing got done with Iran. So if he had just gone and met these people, even though that might be useful in terms of statecraft and diplomacy, it wouldn't have had anything big and splashy with it. So it's like Trump wants to come out being seen as a winner. So he leaves with that, even though diplomatically almost nothing of any substance got done. So I think that's part of the play as well.
Yeah, I always say, he's a transactionalist, or when people say he's a transactionalist, I always like to say he's a spotlight transactionalist. Like a transactionalist would be a little more invested in the details and longer term negotiations. And he really, I think we have a lot of indications that what he really cares about is like the press conference and the coverage that he gets for this stuff. And he kind of moves on pretty fast to whatever it is that he can do next, often without even getting a proper deal. In North Korea, in the first term as an example. So just in response to the sort of geopolitical calculations, and I applaud you, Chris, for using concomitant in a sentence. I've only ever done that in writing, I think. But in response to the geopolitical, calculations, like to me, my initial reaction is, as the kids say, it's not that deep. It's I think it's more, as Dan said earlier, the sort of surface level desire for applause and announcements. And I just one other point that I meant to add before, Chris, you mentioned this idea that we should have a normal business like relationship with Saudi Arabia, and that's been our line, in the first Trump administration, or even in the early Biden administration, when you had Biden as a candidate saying, we should make Saudi Arabia a pariah. And we had Trump, on the other hand, who was pursuing, when he was president, a sort of closer, almost alliance-like relationship with Saudi Arabia, and may yet. But we'd always say this. We don't need to go to either extreme. We can just treat them like a normal country, which is neither an enemy nor an ally. And so I would like to think that we have some indications that we might be heading towards that goal. As I just said, it could wind up being, as you said, that this is a step towards something alliance-like that would involve U.S. security commitments. I hope not, but there's at least some reason, I think, to hope that we could get into that sort of business-like relationship with the Saudi Arabians and just treat them like anybody else with a little more money, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree that the overall political takeaways are kind of meh. There's maybe more splash than substance in this trip. But one potential exception to that is the decision to lift sanctions on Syria. So in some ways, that's geopolitically important. In some ways, it's not. So like Syria is essentially a failed state. It's full of suffering people who have been impoverished for years. They desperately need international investment, aid, trade, all this kind of stuff. But it's not a country whose sort of disposition is going to like swing the balance of power in the region in any particular direction, because it's so just sort of prostrate, based on its sort of economic and social ills. So on the one hand, like what happens in Syria does not necessarily have huge follow-on effects for U.S. policy throughout the region or anything like that. On the other hand, we've had sanctions on Syria my entire life, right? And like, I'm older than I look, right? Like we've had sanctions on Syria since the 70s. And, ever since we came to the conclusion correctly that they were state sponsors of terrorism, right? And we've only increased those sanctions over time. So, the idea that we're taking sanctions off is a big policy change. And perhaps it could herald some kind of deeper change, right? That's what I'm wondering, right? If we were talking about, Trump has been talking about giving them a fresh start and all of this, but it's kind of amazing to me, or not amazing, but significant to me is that we haven't talked about actually taking U.S. troops out of Syria, even though Trump said many times during the campaign, look, Syria is not our fight. We don't have reason to be there, et cetera, et cetera. And now there's this idea that, hey, we can change our relationship with Syria. And maybe the economic thing, taking off sanctions, is the start. And perhaps that could pave a way for military withdrawal. But it's also kind of like, why, if we've decided that we're going to give these guys a chance, how about we just go all the way and also move our troops out, right? Which is probably the most beneficial thing for the U.S., regardless of what happens in Syria. So what do you guys think of that?
Well, I want to jump on that one first, because that's always been something I've been adamant about all the way since 2019, when the ISIS lost their territorial holdings in the last of the Syrian part. I said, listen, we need to get them out right now. There's no militarily achievable mission there. They're just there. And you saw Trump 3 times in his first administration said, I'm going to take them out. And 3 times the headwinds against him inside the administration, inside the DOD, and certainly the talking head world, et cetera, just went crazy and was able to push back and make him not do it, or make him change his mind and not do it. So I haven't even heard him mention it this time, not him, some other have. But I fear, because one of the first things that so many people in the elite class say is Iran. no, we've got to have it for, if anything ever goes with Iran or a hedge. Problem is, those people have no earthly idea what the combat power represented on the ground is, and it's minuscule. It's a tiny little dot. It's mainly for special forces kind of raids here and there, which we cover by claiming that it's anti-ISIS or the enduring defeat of ISIS, etc. I think that we've taken that fake Band-Aid off. But the fact is that there is no military reason to have them there, and they don't provide any kind of military benefit to our country, even if there was an issue with Iran. In fact, all they do is serve as a point of strategic vulnerability, because it makes it easy for Iran to kill Americans, because the air defense systems that we have in some of these small places is tactical air defense, not strategic air defense. So the missiles that Iran could fire, as opposed to the Katyusha rockets that some of these military groups and militants could fire, we can help defend some of those, the drones, etc. They would be so vulnerable. So there is literally no reason to have them there, and every reason for Trump to do it. And now it couldn't be a better time because of these, this new page he's opening with Syria. So I'm adamantly for that.
Yeah, Rose, if I can just go back to the sanctions piece. I think a lot of people were shocked, in large part because, in Washington, sanctions are sort of treated as a panacea to various problems in the world that, we don't have a viable solution that's actually workable or realistic. So let's just slap sanctions on them and kind of move on. And sanctions are very easy to start, but politically they're often very difficult to terminate or even waive for a couple, for a 90 to 180 day period. And I've noticed in the last 48 hours since Trump announced that the sanctions would be lifted or at least suspended, he's actually gotten quite a lot of support on Capitol Hill for that decision from Republicans and Democrats, particularly on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which normally they're, that committee, along with the Banking Committee and every other committee on the planet, is very pro sanctions, and they view it as a way to kind of tackle America's various issues around the world. They're very often hesitant to use the waiver authority in the laws, and presumably Trump is going to be using I think it's a 180-day waiver to lift some of those sanctions temporarily. And Rubio mentioned yesterday, I believe, that if all else goes well, then they're going to work to kind of terminate the Caesar sanctions law, which I also thought was a pretty big deal. By the way, that's also a law that Congress extended last December, so it'll be on the books for another couple of years if they don't terminate it. But anyway, I mean, politically, it's just interesting to me that Trump's decision was not only viewed as necessary, but that it was actually supported by a variety of lawmakers, which traditionally that's not the case.
Yeah, I am in favor of getting rid of the sanctions on Syria, because I think that rebuilding that country is the best thing for Syria. It is kind of ironic, though, that we have at this point spent more than a decade working to overthrow the government in Syria to put some kind of Al-Qaeda offshoot in power. And now, mission accomplished, high fives all around the Situation Room. That's occurred, and now is the point when we, take off sanctions, and it's, sanctions are not very useful in my mind for almost anything. The one thing that you might be able to say about them is that they have a certain power when you take them off in exchange for something, right? You can't really coerce a state to do something by applying sanctions, but you may be able to gain some kind of agreement when you take them off, right? Chaz Freeman had a good analogy for this at some point. It's like a string, like you can pull it, but you can't push it, or something like that. And in the
case, Chris, do you have any examples of when that has worked that way, when we got something by taking sanctions off? I mean, it could be going back years, because I'm not aware of any. I wonder if you are.
Danny, I am, but I'll give you
Libya.
Right?
Yeah. We took sanctions
that didn't work
off.
out good for Libya, did it?
No, it didn't work out well for Libya, right? But Gaddafi, we took some sanctions off, and Gaddafi, got rid of his nuclear program and then lived to sort of regret that.
But Danny,
How about the Iran deal, Danny? I'm sorry, Chris.
Died for a good thing.
I'll tell you though what I had in mind in the case of Syria, though, right? Where maybe we would even intend to take the sanctions off anyway. But one thing that we might want to talk to them about is trying to make sure that we don't have some kind of research and terrorism problem coming out of that country, right? And if Shura actually wants to show that he's changed his stripes and that they're going to be kind of responsible builders of state capacity and get along with people in the region, including us, right? That might be something that we could actually try to gain some assurances about, right? Because that's basically the only interest we have in Syria is basically a negative one, right? At this point, given the fact that we've helped turn it into a failed state, we want to make sure that that relatively ungoverned space doesn't cause new terrorism problems for us, basically.
Yeah, if I could just pipe in, I'd go even a little further than that. It's not just that we want him to be a responsible guy. I mean, whether he's responsible or not, or whether he puts together a government that, adheres to any kind of values that we like or not. And I'm not saying that that's what your definition of responsibility, but it is some people's definition of responsibility. Ultimately, I think what the U.S. wants is just there to be somebody responsible for all of Syria, right? Like, it's good for the U.S. if this country, if the head of Syria has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, or just a monopoly on the use of force, right? Because then, at the very least, we know who to punish if something bad were to happen, right? Not that I think something bad would happen, but the big problem that people always say with failed states, or worry about failed states, is the idea that there's not like one unitary person in charge of it. There's not an obvious return address to retaliate if something comes out of that state, because the central government doesn't control it. So, I would rather see even, a not so nice central government, as long as there's somebody to hold accountable, if we needed to in the future.
Well, and I actually, speaking about a unitary return address, I'm wondering what's going to happen with up in the northeast, where Turkey is, with the Syrian Democratic Forces. How's that going to work out in the south with Israel? And as far as I know, they still haven't withdrawn from all the area that they had in there. So how is all that going to work out? Because it seems to me there's a lot still to resolve, even for Shura.
Yeah. If I could just jump in, I'd say, of course, there's a lot to resolve, and hopefully it can be resolved by the people who live there, and we can stop, imagine that it's our job. I do think the Trump administration, at least in part, is trying to move towards full withdrawal from Syria and consolidating down, I think, now to 2 bases, and then probably they want to go to 0, and then perhaps look at getting troops out of Iraq. We'll see if that sort of sentiment prevails, but I think that's good news. And overall, I think it's interesting to me that the or kind of typical of Trump, I guess, where he announces that he's lifting sanctions on Syria and says he's basically doing it as a favor to the ruler of Saudi Arabia, rather than coming up with some sort of argument about U.S. interests, or even just say, the poor people of Syria have suffered enough, and we're just hurting regular people or something. It's his, I guess, way of looking at the world, that it's this is just a solid he did for his buddy. But more broadly, it just goes to show, I think, and if they do withdraw troops from Syria finally, after all these years of these various arguments about why we need to be there, Iran, ISIS, to help the Kurds, because there's no way we can leave a bunch of ISIS people in prison for someone else to manage. This arguments sort of falling away one by one, at least it seems to me. If we do manage to pull out, it just goes to show, presidents really just have a tremendous amount of rope, at least with these small, relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, military engagements, where you can just ignore basically the rest of Washington at this point, including Congress. I mean, if maybe it would be different if there was a Democratic majority in either house, but as Dan said, the Congress, the majority is just going to go along with what Trump wants to do, at least on this. And the public long ago probably forgot that we have troops in Syria. It's not a salient electoral issue.
Yep.
Or in the sanctions, nobody really understands that. So it's a situation where presidents can do what they think is the best foreign policy for the United States, and not worry most of the time, at least, about you're going to lose an election because of it. And I think that's good news in a way. I mean, it's depressing that Congress has approached Syria from the perspective they never authorized the U.S. troop presence there. But they did authorize a panel of experts that basically argued, that we should stay there forever to chase around the remnants of ISIS. And you had Congress, participating in the kind of collective DC freakout that Danny mentioned when Trump said, we're getting out of Syria. So, it's sad what's happened to Congress and their foreign policy powers. But overall, it's good that, if you're president, you can kind of ignore all the noise and just say, there's good reason to leave, so we're leaving.
Well, to just sort of take us back to what might be a slightly more salient issue than the millions of little, not literally millions, but all these tiny little deployments the U.S. has all over the world, which matter, but as in sort of the dinner table discussion, something that rises more to that level is Iran and these negotiations with Iran and what could potentially come out of them. And obviously Trump didn't go to Iran, right? It wasn't part of his Middle East trip, but it sort of loomed in the background of all of these discussions in kind of interesting ways. And so, I'm curious what you guys think about where the U.S. is heading on that. Trump's most recent sort of rhetorical moves have been much more conciliatory, although they haven't been absent of threats of violence, right? Threats of using U.S. military power to get Iran to the table. How important is a deal? How realistic is a deal? How much did that influence the stuff that we saw this week on the trip, even though it wasn't, officially the reason for going?
Maybe in responding to this, we can go in the original order, because Dan, it might be good if you sort of just say where we are in terms of this kind of confusing back and forth among the administration officials about enrichment and what exactly their policy or non-policy is there.
Yeah, sure. So, for an outsider looking at this stuff, it's sometimes difficult because you talk to three administration officials about what the United States is trying to achieve in these negotiations, and you sort of get three different answers in terms of like the details. Trump has been kind of elusive. He's basically stated Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. That's his policy, which, okay, that's great. But, when you get down to the negotiating table, the question is, how do you achieve it? We know what the end goal is, but how are you going to get to the end goal? And I think there's been kind of a internal debate within the administration about what these negotiations should accomplish. You had Mike Waltz basically talking about full dismantlement of the Iran nuclear program, which sounds like a very ominous version of the Libya-style deal back in 2003, 2004, that John Bolton helped negotiate. And I use negotiate in quotes right there. There's also, there's discussion with Witkoff, who's taking point in these negotiations. He's sort of gone back and forth. At one point, he said, we can live with an Iranian enrichment program as long as they don't enrich above 3.67%, which is, of course, what the JCPOA was. And that's the same deal that Trump threw in the toilet. And then we have Marco Rubio, who basically is sort of threaded the needle between those two positions. Iran can have a civil nuclear program, but they have to import nuclear fuel. They can't have an enrichment on Iranian soil. So, it's sort of difficult to know what the actual position of the United States is. All we do know is the talks have gone 4 rounds now. Evidently, there's been enough progress made that those negotiations continue, which is, an optimistic thing. But in terms of the details, yeah, I mean, it seems like seems like the U.S. position changes every other day. So, as everything with the Trump administration, we're just going to have to sort of wait and see what the actual policy is, because for a layman like myself who's interested in this stuff, it's sort of confusing to batten down the hatches here. And is it this is the position A, B, or C, or all three? Sometimes it's all three, depending on who you talk to.
I think maybe the accompaniment to our shared conclusion that Trump's trip was a bit anticlimactic or not as dramatic as it might have been, is that whatever Steve Witkoff is up to at a given moment is maybe the most interesting thing that the administration is doing. And Trump kind of has this tendency to, Witkoff is dealing with Ukraine, and that seems like it's promising, so he has him deal with like everything. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best way to implement policy, because you're overloading either a person or a team of people, and that might not actually be advantageous. But one thing that should be said that I'm not sure I've made clear enough in terms of my own opinion, so I'm just going to make this as clear as possible, is we're talking about this trip. Trump has visited the Middle East, and it should just really be put in perspective that the Middle East is not very important from the United States strategic point of view. And Trump has been devoting, I think, especially given the sense that the Ukraine, the process of trying to get some kind of a deal on Ukraine, that seems to have stalled or slowed down, or the U.S. isn't driving that process the way that it seemed they might have a couple months ago. There's a lot of attention that's being spent on the Middle East. And the U.S. has much bigger problems than whatever's happening in the Middle East. It would be to our benefit not to be involved at all, in my opinion, or to be wrapping up our involvement in various ways. But I think that Trump is focusing on the Middle East generally because it's kind of low-hanging fruit in a way. And I suppose what I'm trying to drive at here is that that itself is kind of discouraging to me, because it seems like that, whatever radical changes in U.S. foreign policy might have been signaled by Trump at various points, it's, to me, it's all just kind of marginal things around the edges that he's actually doing, and that all this focus on the Middle East is just because it's an easy place to do it, and he's not changing anything fundamental. He's kind of inking these little deals and whatever. Witkoff, who's an interesting outsider character, might end up accomplishing something, but like Dan was saying, it's very difficult to. There's very little consistent direction in the administration that would give you a sense of what they're actually driving towards, and what you really get the sense of is that they're making it up as they go along, and dealing with low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. I guess I'll just add to what was already said by saying, one, it's possible the Trump administration continues to have two basically irreconcilable goals. One is they want, at least at times, as was mentioned, they're saying they want an Iran deal that involves no enrichment. And, presumably this proposal the Iranians made for some sort of Gulf consortium of enrichment is not going to work, because the other countries don't want to do it. So, it's likely that the Iranians will say that's not an acceptable outcome for us. We've come this far. We don't want to go back to where we were. Now, maybe that's not true. I could be wrong about that, but it seems likely to me. And then on the other hand, you still have the position that Trump takes that he'll help Israel bomb Iran in the event that there's no deal, with the sort of slippery time frame around, you should do it soon, you should do it within whatever, a deadline that doesn't seem real. So I don't know that, he can have both those things if he indeed wants both those things. So yeah, on the one hand, Trump seems to want to deal with Iran. He seems to want to avoid war with Iran. On the other hand, you could still argue that he's setting himself up for having to bomb Iran. And this president, even more than others, seems totally divorced from audience costs. Like the idea that if you say you're going to do something, it's hard to get out of doing it. Like he really is. The Yemen thing is a great example of the Houthi bombing, where he just declared victory and didn't get at all what he said he wanted, and it's just moved on, proving that you can do that. It doesn't, at least in these sort of lower stakes circumstances. But so there's reason to be optimistic about Iran, certainly, but there's also this big risk hovering much more at the same time that he doesn't want war and wants a deal. I think the likelihood that we wind up bombing Iran is higher than it has been in some time. So that's mixed. And just to the larger point about the region, I think Dan and our colleague Jennifer Kavanaugh wrote about this. There's this reporting on this memo that came out where the Trump administration was talking about shifting its focus and even forces to Asia, and there's a sort of the coverage of it was sort of like, well, this is just cut and pasted from Project 2025. That's bad. But at their point in that article, which maybe I should have let Dan talk to, is well, really they're not doing it. That's the big takeaway here. Thus far they've bogged themselves down in various troubles in the Middle East. Now we got out of the Houthi thing, it would appear, but we're not shifting. So I agree with Chris. They're kind of, their focus, at least in large part, seems to be Ukraine and the Middle East. So this idea that we were going to prioritize Asia is at least on the back burner, if not canceled.
Yeah, it's kind of easy to announce that you're gonna stop bombing the Houthis when you've stepped up bombing the Houthis 2 months previously or whatever. But it doesn't leave you anywhere positive.
Yeah.
Just doesn't deepen the worries. I would say 3 real quick points that I think don't get enough, and in some cases no consideration in this whole issue here. And that's number 1, legality. Can we attack another country because they, quote, won't prevent nuclear weapons? We calculate that they don't. I don't see anything in the Constitution that allows that. I don't see anything in the 1973 War Powers Act, which allows the president, the commander-in-chief, to unilaterally go and attack another country because he doesn't like their policy or where they may be going somewhere. Now, I know we have violated the 1973 War Powers Act and this whole issue of the constitutionality of the Congress being the only arm to declare war decades ago, but it still is on the books. And I think by making it so common to just ignore that category altogether makes it more likely that at some point some president does get us sucked into a war we should never fight because no one did anything to actually hold him accountable. Second thing is the efficacy. Is it going to work? Can you actually prevent them from having a nuclear weapon? Because they have issues like they bury this stuff deep inside mountains. We have bunker busters. It's untested whether they can get in there. In large part, the Iranians know the capability of these weapons, and they may well have dug them in deep enough to be able to make that neutralized so that they won't function here. The second thing on that point of the efficacy is if anything is going to push Iran into a nuclear weapon, it's going to be that. If you go in and you declare war on them, and you literally start trying to blow all their facilities up, then they have every reason to say, now we're going to go to it. They've implied this and in some cases stated it outright. Third thing is diplomatically. China, Russia, Russia has a military alliance with Iran because they get drones and whatnot. Also, China still gets a lot of oil from Iran. Neither of those countries is going to be keen on seeing that regime fall, which of course is the Israeli objective. That's what they want, regime change. They've said so directly and overtly. Then you even have Saudi Arabia, because they've been trying to do rapprochement with Iran and improve relations better. And I'm not sure that they want some unknown regime to emerge after that, et cetera, something they don't know. So there's a lot of things beyond just, this statement that Iran's not going to have a bomb. I mean, there's a lot of ways to go after that, to prevent that, even though they don't have a bomb. Dan's mentioned several times the first Obama, the JCPOA itself, went a long way toward that. And if we get an Obama light deal here, I'll be the first one to cheer that on in any term, in any form that avoids war. But those are all real important things that we need to look at before we think about dropping one bomb.
Yeah, I agree. And, I got to say, I think it's an excellent point that, what essentially is on the table is a preventive war, right? It's a preventive war. It's the idea that we would attack somebody that hasn't attacked us, and not somebody who's in the process of attacking us, right? It's not a preemptive war. It'd be a preventive war to prevent or try to prevent, probably wouldn't actually work to, in the long run, prevent it, but try to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. And the history for preventive wars is bad, right? like whether you go back to Thucydides, right? You go back across all of human history, and most countries that fight preventive wars, it does not work out well for them, right? They end up cutting off their nose to spite their face. So like the long-term history of it is bad, but also the recent history of it is bad, right? The last time we fought a preventive war was Iraq in 2003. And we all know how badly that turned out, right? And Iran is not Iraq. Iran's 3 times the size of Iraq, both in terms of people and in terms of land, right?
Yeah, and one of the biggest sins we did in the Iraq War was no one answered the question, and then what? You go in and you take out Saddam Hussein, and then what? We didn't have a plan for that. And I think there's even less of a and then what here. We want to take out their nuclear facilities, and then what? You've started a war. Where do you think that Iran's going to go? I mean, that needs to be thought through a lot more.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, Iraq, it was all magical thinking. They had an idea, which was that there's going to be this like liberal uprising, and Iraq's going to suddenly become a democracy, and then it'll be our friend and all this sort of crazy stuff. But I think you're right. I don't think they've even gotten to the magical thinking part with Iran, because they're still not, they're still not like willing to. Well, yeah, I agree. It's problematic. It's not good. But that's what's really sort of lurking in the background of all this discussion, right? Is that really what you're going to do?
Just to add something else, which is, a point Rose likes to make as well. The status quo for the United States is fine. Iran is not a threat to the United States.
Yes,
I think it's important to say that. It's a threat, perhaps, to some of its neighbors, but its neighbors can deal with that as they want, I think. But in Iran, that's a nascent nuclear weapon state, that's sanctioned, it's far from ideal, but for the US, it doesn't really matter. We can live with that. And we've gotten ourselves into this position, which is not Donald Trump's fault. I mean, it precedes him to a large extent. He's just continued it, where, our position is, either we solve everything and you're, miles away from having nukes, or we go to war. And that's, in a sense, been the position of, I don't know, the last 4 presidents, and it's bad. We should just care less about Iran, even if they get a nuke. But we should just care less about Iran and sort of move on with our lives. They don't, we don't have some fundamental rivalry with them, a contested interest that can't be resolved without a deal or a war. So I think, I don't think we can solve that in the near term, but this sort of obsession with Iran as an enemy and a problem to solve is the real issue.
It would also be a war that, if successful in the aim of, toppling the government, or even if it just significantly weakened Iran or something, like the outcome of the war would be to significantly change the balance of power in the region. And this is a region where there is already a rough relative balance of power, which is kind of supposed to be the thing that we hope for in regions of importance. Now, again, this is not a region of importance, right? But if it were, right, we would not want there to be a significant imbalance of power in the favor of a single power. And it seems like, lots of people in Washington want there to be a significant imbalance in power in favor of Israel. And it should be said, like, the United States doesn't get any benefit from that being the case, or from Israel approaching something like hegemony in the broader Middle East.
All right. Well, let's leave it at that, because we've reached our witching hour, where our conversation's up. But that was a lot of fun, guys. Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for watching. and we'll continue to see, what comes out of this trip in the long term. All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.